Hello, Assalamu alaikum, namaste, Sat Sri Akal. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the Azeeza Show. Last week we had Katerina McLeod join us and we talked about the issue of human trafficking and how it affects women. This week we're actually going to talk about gender equality and Islam and religion in particular. So I want to really talk to you, I'm very excited to have our guests here, Azeeza Kanji and Munera Yusuf. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
For having us. For sure. Thank you for having us.
It's one of those things where, I know that, with this organization, Azeeza, and the show that's been, has sort of started to broadcast and people are starting to really hear about it, we've started to have a lot of women reach out to us, right? And a lot of the women that, we're starting to have friendship circles where women are coming out and having discussions about their lives and sort of the things that, they want to share. And sometimes it's just about meeting new women and having fun, right? But there's always the discussions that we'd like to have about, how can we ensure that women actually feel more respected and honored, right? And that's a big part of what Azeeza is all about. So, I wanted to sort of talk to both of you about what it is that, gender equality actually means. Because a lot of the women often talk about the fact that, sometimes they're unsure as to whether or not we say that, the religions are all about gender equality, but is that actually being, actualized is the big question. So why don't we start with, both of you introducing yourselves and then we'll get into the discussion. Do you want to start?
Mm-hmm. I'm Azeeza Kanji. I'm the Director of Programming at Noor Cultural Center. I'm also a legal academic with a Master's of Law specializing in Islamic law from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, and a journalist who writes about issues related to law, Islamophobia, racism, and social justice.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here.
Good stuff.
All right, Munera.
My name is Munera Yusuf, and I am a queer person of color who likes to publicly speak. I enjoy it thoroughly. I'm a writer. I'm also working on a documentary for Sundance Film Festival, and I'm a fool. I just like to play around. I like having fun with my friends, and I go to Ryerson, but I also took time off to really pursue what I want. And I'm doing a lot of projects right now, but most of all, I think I am so excited to kind of fall right into people like Azeeza and you, Farheen, and just try to find out more so knowledge about Islam.
Well, thank you for, and Munera, you're one of the examples, right, of one of the women that's just sort of reached out to us and was like, I'd really like to have a conversation, so I'm very grateful that you're here. It's really important that you're here and that, your voice is being heard.
Thank you.
So let's sort of jump right into it if that's okay. So what do you, so Azeeza, you just said that you have a, degree in, law with a particular interest in Islamic studies. So can you tell us what inspired you to get into that?
In our current context, I think we see how Sharia phobia is really a very prominent element of Islamophobia. We're constantly hearing fears being raised about creeping Sharia, about how Muslims are trying to impose Sharia on everyone, and their vision of what Sharia is a very harsh vision of what law looks like, something that's primarily concerned with very strict criminal punishments, for example, and something that's very oppressive towards women. And I think when we study what the Islamic legal tradition actually is, we can see that these Sharia phobes actually have no idea about what it is that they're talking about. We know that the Islamic legal tradition historically was a very diverse tradition. Only a very tiny part of it was concerned with criminal punishments, and there were very strict prohibitions and limitations placed on when those criminal punishments could be carried out. So that, for example, in the whole history of the Ottoman Empire, which was centuries long, there's only one recorded instance of a woman receiving capital punishment for adultery. We also know that many of the things which now Islamophobes say are really central to Sharia, like so-called honor killings, for example, are actually things that were imported into Muslim societies by European colonial powers. So in classical Islamic law, there is no excuse for honor killing, and honor killing is treated like a murder. However, during the colonial period, European powers imported provisions into criminal codes saying that if a man killed his wife, out of a crime of passion because he caught her with a lover or something like that, that they would receive a lesser punishment because a woman was considered to be her man's property. So that's something that's purely imported through European colonial processes, and yet now that's projected onto Muslims as something that is essential to our tradition. Unfortunately, I think as Muslims also we tend to internalize many of these Islamophobic representations of our own tradition that were developed precisely in order to justify our oppression and colonization. And so I think it's essential for us as Muslims to know our own history, to know our own legal tradition, not only to refute Islamophobic representations, but also so that we have a more accurate understanding of ourselves.
Right.
Very beautifully put, honestly.
That's great. I just want to like add that, you know, when you talk about like the Sharia phobes and stuff, when I was running in 2015 for the federal election, I remember standing in town hall with like thousands of people, and this one man stood up and he's like, "If you get elected, will you impose Sharia law in Canada?" And I was like, no.
Like, you mean charity and protections for women's autonomy, and I'm definitely pro Sharia candidate.
I was like, yeah, no, that's not what I'm here for. But so it's true. There's a lot of that, right? There's that concern, but I think also, I mean, and let me sort of just sort of put it out there and be like, I also think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about our own sort of, faith and religion from our own community members, right? We ourselves are not as educated as we should be. And often I think part of that has, is partly the reason why, these right-wing people are actually sort of taking that and just running with it, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Munera, or
no, please go ahead.
So I
both
think,
of you, whatever.
When we don't know our own histories, people can
Right.
tell us anything about ourselves,
Right.
and we'll believe it. And so even when we look at the debates around the sex ed curriculum, for example, or about sexuality, in Islam, we know historically that Muslim societies were actually demonized by colonizers for being too sexually liberated, for not being sexually oppressive enough. There's long traditions of sexual pluralism in Muslim societies that colonizers explicitly tried to erase, and they use that as a reason for the civilizing mission, that it's necessary to bring Muslims in line with their own repressive sexual norms that they were developing in the Victorian era in Europe.
Right.
And yet now as Muslims, it's as if we think that these norms are actually very central to our tradition, and we protect them very fiercely, whereas actually what we're doing is becoming ventriloquists for colonial ideas that were imposed on Muslim societies.
Yeah. To add to that is, interestingly enough, you said something earlier, you said something along the lines of how in our history there's only been a count of one stoning of a woman for adultery. So there's
in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. So there's this movie that is on Netflix. It's called The Stoning of Soraya, and I watched that when I was about 16 years old. And I remember watching that movie and being completely appalled and scared. Like, I can't believe these things happen. But that's not clarified. What you just said is it shows the poor representation of how these countries govern and rule themselves. Yes, there's misogyny. Yes, there's horrible abusers out there. Yes, there's murderers. But you're not clarifying that this is not something that we all stand for.
Exactly, and when we see stories like that, the blame tends to be attributed to Islam, as if Islam is something monolithic that is existed in a stable and uniform way throughout time, whereas actually the forms of violence that we're seeing against Muslim women enacted in the name of Sharia or Islamic law are actually very much a product of the way that modern nation states use the idea of Sharia to consolidate their power, using very oppressive mechanisms of policing and surveillance that are very much a product of modernity. They haven't been present throughout Islamic history. In fact, the Islamic legal tradition puts a great deal of importance on protecting people's privacy, which is part of the reason why harsh criminal punishments were only carried out in very rare cases. And so what modern nation states are doing is that they're taking some of the harshest interpretations of Sharia, but then taking away all of the limitations and and protections for people that were placed on their application. And so what we're seeing now, you know, when people attribute this to Sharia or Islamic law, no, it's actually a very specific manifestation of the Islamic legal tradition that has arisen with the development of modern nation states in the post-colonial period, and it's really no kind of reflection on the Islamic legal tradition as a whole.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that I can speak for myself, that we worry about, right, is the fact that, you know, when you're starting to point out some of these, you know, these misconceptions and sort of misunderstandings of what actually it means to be, you know, quote, Muslim, right? You know, there's always that questioning. Like, I know I grew up in the mosque, right, with my father, and spent most of my time there as he was, you know, with his peers were sort of building up the first mosque in Mississauga. And, you know, we grew up in a very religious household, right? So the whole concept of like questioning was a big issue. It was like, well, you don't question, right? Like, you just believe what's being said. Is there a way to question, you know, what is actually being taught without questioning, quote, the words of God?
For me, honestly, I was the question master. My family hated me. They're just like, because Allah said so, Munera, shut up! Like, you know, stop talking. And I'm like, no, it's not about what Allah said so. You can't come up to me and say, I should be cleaning the house because I'm a woman. But you're not saying anything to my male counterpart, my cousin, who's the same age as me. You don't come up to me and you don't say, oh, you need to marry a man because you moved out of the house. But you would never say that to my cousin who moves to Alberta by himself to go work and make money. Right? So whenever I would take a stand, I would always take a stand from a human rights perspective, and that's how I question it.
Right.
We're equals.
Right.
And you could stand there, but until you say that the Quran says a man and a woman are not equal, that's when I'll listen to you. But you never do, because you know that's not true, right?
Perfect. I'm actually going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back. All right, we'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. You're watching the Azeeza Show, and with me today are Azeeza Kanji and Munera Yusuf, and we're talking about gender equality and religion, in particular Islam. So, you know, Azeeza, you were going to say something just before we took a break.
Oh, so you asked about how, as Muslims, we can engage in questioning without questioning the word of God. And I think it's interesting how often what is said to be the word of God often just sounds like the voice of powerful men in our community.
Right.
If you look at the legal tradition, there was a distinction that was made between Sharia, which is God's idea of what the law is, versus fiqh, which is human interpretation of the law. And it was always understood that as humans, our interpretation of texts or what the law should be are always fallible, limited by our context, limited by our own understanding, and so can never be elevated to the same level as the word of God, which is why jurists would end their opinions with saying, Allahu Alam, God knows best.
Right.
In other words, as humans, we always have to appreciate that any of our interpretations are always provisional and limited, and so we have to come to that with a certain amount of humility.
Right, exactly. No, I'm really glad you said that, because often that's the thing. Like, there's so much fear, right, that I know that we've grown up with. At least I can speak for myself. And so, you know, just recognizing that questioning is something, and educating ourselves is so important, right, on what actually is the case. I know one of the things that, you know, I was just, you know, I've been seeing actually with a lot of the women that have reached out, and I would say in my own personal journey as well. You know, I, like many other people, unfortunately, went through like a fraudulent marriage where there was this whole, you know, immigration thing, right? Person wanted immigration, whatever. And just being able to navigate the system, right? To be like, okay, well, I want to get a khula, or like, you know, a divorce as a woman, you know, and the difficulty I had with that, because, you know, they were like, well, you're a woman, you're too emotional, you know, you can't make that decision. Like, are you sure you want to do this? Like, this type of thing, right? And then being told afterwards to be like things like, oh my God, you did that? Like, did you know that you know, single-handedly like moved the throne of God? Like, you know, and I remember feeling so sad and like,
so we're simultaneously so emotional and weak, but so powerful.
Right? I was like, I don't think that's what, you know, actually happened. But, you know, the fact that I was like raised in a particular environment, I actually felt sad. I was like, oh my God, what if I did, right? So how do you support women that are actually thinking about these things, you know, and actually having to deal with some of these things?
Personally, I think that, so that's a question that has actually plagued me as well, in a sense, where I've seen so many beautiful women grow up around me that are put into uncomfortable circumstances. Especially, people don't actually understand too that Muslims have common law marriage most of the time. We're actually not binded together through papers or anything like that. So when you're going through a divorce, you're going to your family and you're telling them your relationship baggage, and you're telling them things that maybe you don't want to include, but people may not want to believe you too, right? How am I supposed to go to this person and say, hey, my husband is treating me like this, but you won't listen to it, or I'm too ashamed to tell you it, so thus relating to you saying, no, you should stay in this marriage.
Right.
You shouldn't leave this marriage. And that's also a big reality. And I've seen that, like
Right.
women not being able to be forthcoming towards their family and then their husband's family, because mostly they bring them all together, and
the
that's what I've
notion
seen.
of patience, right, or sabr.
Exactly.
Which is a big piece
So
of that.
being patient, and it's like almost you're going through a humiliating trial in a sense. But what I would tell women who are going through that, if you find yourself having to pray for Allah to take you away from this pain, if you find yourself looking at yourself in the mirror and not being happy with yourself, just know that that is a sign from Allah Himself to get you out of this. And He wouldn't give you those feelings and that conscious awareness, because so many people are abused and don't even know they're abused.
That's right.
So many women are battered and don't even know that they're battered. So if He gives you that willpower inside of you, just know that He's giving that to you for a reason. And you should take it and you should run with it, and you should tell everybody to run with the wind, go kick rocks, you know?
Thank you, I appreciate that.
So first of all, as Muslim women, I think it's important for us, again, to know our history. The legal historian Amira Sanbal, for example, has done studies of courts in Ottoman Egypt, which found that women had very ready and free access to divorce in that time. So this idea that restricting women's access to divorce is an authentic representation of our tradition just simply doesn't fit with the history that we have, where women often exerted a lot of agency and power in asserting their rights and fighting for their rights, and in having their rights protected, protected by the courts that were tasked to protect their rights. We also know throughout Islamic history there have been so many cases of amazing women who were scholars, women who were legal experts. The first university in the world in Morocco was founded by a woman in the 9th century, and yet now we erase all of those women from our history when we act like women don't have the capacity for intelligence, that we're just emotional, that we can't be trusted with rights that were given to us by the Quran and by the practice of the Prophet. When we look at the descriptions of marriage in the Quran, it is very clear. It says that couples should stay together with kindness and with mercy and with tranquility, or they should separate with kindness and with justice. And so this idea that women should be required to stay in relationships that are abusive is absolutely not a fair or accurate representation of what the Quranic text says, which consistently condemns oppression, tells Muslims that they have to act against oppression, and gives people a right to flee oppression when they are experiencing it. And in fact, the idea that men should have some kind of authority over women just by virtue of their status of men is not an expression of Islamic ethics. In fact, it's an expression of the ethics that were expressed by Shaitan when he said that he shouldn't have to bow down to Adam simply because he was created of fire, whereas man was created of clay. This assertion of superiority simply on the basis of biological characteristics that from an Islamic perspective have no bearing on our worth as human beings, which, as we read in the Quran, is determined on the basis of piety alone, not on the basis of race, not on the basis of gender, not on the basis of sexuality, not on the basis of class, not on the basis of ability. And so this idea that women should have to stay in abusive relationships because they are required to be under the authority of their husbands or other men in their lives is not only a misrepresentation of the tradition, it actually does violence to our tradition.
Right. And so question for you then, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I'm very conscious that there are women now that are reaching out to us that are far beyond even our own networks, that are reaching really, you know, it's really starting to grow, right? And some of the women that reach out are actually talking about the fact that there's a particular verse in the Quran that everybody always cites, right? Particularly, we hear it from some of the men to justify, you know, this notion of striking your wife. So can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
So first of all, as I've said, the overall picture of marriage that's presented in the Quran is one where men and women are seen to be beautiful garments for each other, and where we're supposed to live, as I said, together in kindness or tranquility, or separate with kindness and with justice. We also know from the Sunnah of the Prophet, which is meant to be the living expression of how to live a Quranic life, that he never engaged in abusive behavior with any of his wives. And in fact, we know his wives were very strong personalities and independent personalities, that they would frequently express their opinions to the Prophet. And so when we come across one verse in the Quran that is being read in a way that contradicts the rest of the Quran as well as the Sunnah of the Prophet, I think we have to question whether the interpretations of that verse that are being put forward are really an accurate representation of the tradition. In the case of the so-called beating verse 434, the word daraba, which is commonly translated as to beat, has by some scholars been translated as meaning something else, for example, to go away from, because they argue that that's more coherent with the rest of the Quranic picture of marriage and of gender relations, as well as the prophetic example. Other scholars point out that at the time when the Quran was revealed in a patriarchal context, men had almost unlimited powers to use violence against their wives, and so this verse, which says that first men must admonish their wives and go away from their beds, was actually imposing severe restrictions on men's ability to use any kind of violence against their wives. And so as Muslims today, we have to think about how we continue that trajectory towards limiting men's ability to wield violence against women, as the most authentic interpretation of what that verse means and of what the Quranic message is.
Well, that's great. Thank you for saying that. I think that's something that we all, have heard, and I know a lot of people question that, particularly the women I've been talking to lately. So I want to kind of switch gears a little bit, if that's okay, and talk about, since you're both here, like, do you think that that there's an opportunity to make the mosque a more inclusive space for women?
So I think that there's grand opportunity, but that opportunity must actually come in effect where women, one, like you said, we all need to actually delve into education and to find as much information as we can to stand and to know our rights as people, but also to just take a stand and apply for grants and do whatever you got to do and try to open your own mosques and try to, like you said, I believe that you lead the sermons at some mosques, yeah?
At Noor Cultural Center, yes, we have women giving the sermons, and I'm one of the
Right, that's
women.
great.
And we also have men giving sermons.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I think that's amazing. I think that in itself, like, blew my mind. I was completely so happy about that, because I think the most acknowledging thing for me, and especially my identity, is that I know that somebody out there is pushing boundaries. And I feel like you just got to keep pushing boundaries. And that's what history is all about. If you go back 50 years in time, the boundaries that we did not push may not have been here. My rights may have not been here as a Black person, as a gay person. It would not be existent. So we all just kind of need to push as much boundaries as possible. But as for the men, I think it's important that they give pedestals as well, and that they are actually acknowledging and putting women up forward too. It's a huge kind of, imagine yourself rowing in a canoe. You can't do anything if 4 people decide, I don't want to do anything, out of the 12 people inside.
Right.
We all need to go forward and push against the tides, push against the currents, push against anything that's happening today in order to get to tomorrow and be happy about it and proud.
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons I appreciate that, that's very important, what you've just said. And I think one of the things that I also found in my own life was, like, when I was running in the election, for example, I had a really hard time sort of getting access to the mosque, right? And being able to speak in front of, the male congregations and stuff like that, because, I was, quote, a Muslim woman, and I wasn't supposed to be seen or heard, and there were different people, right? So I have to say some people were more, much more welcoming than others, but there's still that challenge, right, that we had to kind of deal with. So, as you said, like, what are your thoughts on this?
So, in Islam, we don't have a top-down structure of authority saying that, you know, this is absolutely permissible and this is absolutely impermissible.
Right.
The way that our tradition has always evolved has been by people voting with their feet for the interpretations that they like, which is why when Wahhabism, for example, was originally developed, it wasn't accepted by a majority of Muslims, and it didn't really gain traction until European powers started supporting it for their own ends. And so in Islam, and as Muslims, I think we've always had the ability to be very agentic in implementing the visions of Islam that we think of as being just. In our current context in Toronto, I think it's important that we have a diversity of spaces because people are comfortable in different kinds of spaces. So at Noor, for example, we have women praying on one side of the room and men praying on the other with no barrier, but just an aisle separating them. And both we have women and men delivering the khutbah. And for us, that was important because based on the verse in the Quran, 49:13, which talks about how humans have been created from a male and female and made into nations and tribes so that we may come to know one another. Our perspective at Noor is that as humans located in particular social locations, we all only can ever have grasp of a small fragment of the truth, and so it's important for women and men to hear different perspectives from the minbar. And so some women say they would only come to Noor, but other women say that they would never come to Noor and they don't feel comfortable practicing in that way. And so I think the thing that's important is that we have the freedom to establish a diversity of different types of places, and then people have the freedom to choose.
Wonderful.
I think ideally also, I think you mentioned that some women don't want to come.
Right.
And I think that is, you're right. But what makes me happy, especially now, is that there's such a thing called safe spaces.
Yes.
So women-only mosques would be amazing too, honestly. And I think that's definitely a goal and a ideal way to kind of open the gate for women who may be traumatized, women who may be suffering, women who may not want to run into their ex-partners at the mosque.
Right.
Anything to kind of show safe space and respect to anybody who needs so.
That's wonderful, and I hear you on that, absolutely. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much to both of you. We've run out of time. I wish we had more time, but you know, this show goes by pretty quickly. So thank you again for being here, and thank you to the audience for watching. If you have questions, if you've got thoughts on what we've said, please reach out. Certainly, you know, we want to keep the conversation going. Until next week, take care.